Okay, we are unmuted, and so we are unmuted. We're trying to get people back in the room, and we have people on Zoom. So we're now going to move to the second of the three segments, and I think that the PFAS definitely brings up some very critical issues, which is with all the uncertainties that you'll hear about from Kristen related to PFAS, what are appropriate ways to consider it, to respond, et cetera. So in a way with PFAS, I think the cart has been put before the horse, but I'll let others interpret that. We did discuss this issue actually in 2020 from the perspective of Alex Beeler, who was then Assistant Secretary of the Army. And someone mentioned today that DOD has had a very strong presence on developing PFAS strategy. So unfortunately, we don't have anyone from DOD today, but we might actually have someone. Do we have someone from DOD on online? No, Larry? No, okay, all right. So we'll look at how these chemicals might be considered in the context of natural resource damages, and Lena is going to introduce the panel in a moment. But I will introduce Lana, if that's how you prefer us to, okay. So I'm going to introduce Lana and appreciate her stepping into this role. She's special counsel at Kelly Dry, where her practice focuses on environmental litigation as well as commercial litigation. Her environmental practice includes representing states and sovereigns in complex environmental litigation, including natural resource damages. She also has experience representing companies before state administrative bodies. She's represented many states and sovereigns on multi-district litigation arising from PFAS, related to firefighting foam as well. So she is well qualified, and we work very closely with Kelly Dry and her colleagues, particularly Bill Jackson. They have been quite instrumental in helping to develop the framework, in fact. So I will give it to you and we are going to go to 5:15, exactly an hour and a half, and then we'll have 15 minutes of wrap up and tell you what's happening tomorrow. And we're meeting at a different location tomorrow, so I want to give you the specifics on that too. All right.
All right, is that working? Great. Well, thank you, Barbara, for the introduction, and thank you everyone who's here in person and online, and for sticking around so far. It's nearing the end of the day. We're the last panel, so thank you for paying attention. As Barbara said, we're going to be talking about PFAS here in the framework. So I'm going to start off by introducing our panelists. First is Kristen Robrock, who is going to present the framework. Kristen is a managing engineer in Exponent's environmental sciences practice. She's based in Oakland, California. Dr. Robrock is an environmental engineer who specializes in the fate and transport of chemicals in the environment, with an expertise in emerging contaminants, including PFAS. She specializes in environmental forensics, reconstructing environmental releases to determine the sources, timing, and mechanisms of contaminant releases. So she will be presenting the framework for us first, and then we will be turning to a Q&A. We did have a slight change. We have one less panelist than we did before, so we have 3 panelists. I'm just going to go in alphabetical order. Right next to me here is Keegan Brown. Keegan is a partner at Latham & Watkins in the litigation and trial department based in New York. He represents clients in complex environmental regulatory and litigation matters, particularly involving contaminated sediment sites, NRD, toxic torts, and PFAS. Keegan also advises buyers, sellers, and lenders and underwriters in a broad range of environmental issues in mergers, acquisitions, and financing transactions. He has several accolades from various publications, including Chambers, Legal 500, and Law 360. Online, I think, do we have? Do we? Okay. All right, we have Bill DeVoge. He is the founder and president of W.H. DeVoge and Associates Incorporated, located in St. Augustine, Florida. He has conducted economic valuation studies for more than 30 years, specializes in NRDA, and has worked on more than 35 assessments since 1987, including major damage assessments for releases in the Clark Ford River, Lavaca Bay, Fox River, Wisconsin. He's been retained on several PFOS or PFAS cases in the United States, and has been admitted as an expert in measuring NRD in federal court, and is a qualified expert on NRDA and natural resource economics. He's co-authored 4 books on natural resource economics and 69 peer-reviewed articles. So thank you, Bill, for being online today. I see your face now. And last but not least, here in the middle is Bart Sept, who is a senior counsel at Baker Botts here in DC. Bart handles a wide range of environmental, health, and safety matters, including regulatory counseling, complex litigation, and transactions, with experience in advising corporate and public sector clients regarding complex regulatory compliance and enforcement issues under most of the major federal environmental statutes. In environmental consulting, he regularly advises clients regarding the myriad regulatory, permitting, and enforcement issues associated with product stewardship, hazardous waste generation, disposal, and the like. So we're going to start off with Dr. Robrock presenting the framework.
All right, thank you, Lana. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent, all right. So I am very much honored to be here. I'm excited to present with the group that I've been working with for the past 2 years on this framework, but just also really honored to be presenting with so many other fantastic speakers today. So I will talk about this best practice framework for PFAS and natural resource damages that we've been working on for a couple of years now. So in terms of the outline, I'll present some background, the potential benefits. I'll introduce the framework and then walk through the framework in some detail with some kind of specific examples. I did want to give a shout out to Jeff Rose for his talk earlier, where he introduced PFAS and really laid the groundwork for us so we don't have to explain why these are really of interest and why it's such an important issue right now. So why do we need a framework for PFAS? When I was asked to join this group 2 years ago, I was asking myself the same question. I mean, we've been doing NRD for 30 years. There's plenty of guidance on there. Why do we need a new framework for PFAS? And the more we got to working collaboratively and thinking about what this framework would include, the more it became apparent why we need this framework and how important it could be. And this is for a number of reasons. So I'm going to start with the main reason being is that PFAS is such a complicated family of chemicals that really poses some unique challenges from a scientific perspective, from a regulatory perspective, technical perspective. And we haven't seen something really with this level of complexity before. If we look at other compounds that we've worked with, say PCBs, where there's a large group of compounds, they don't have the breadth of different properties that we have with PFAS. So say PCBs, tend to behave generally kind of similarly. Whereas if we look at PFAS, they just have completely different properties, completely different health impacts, depending on which ones you look at. And so it just really enhances the complexity of this group of chemicals. We're also working in an environment that is constantly changing from a regulatory perspective, a technical perspective. We're learning things basically daily. For any of those of you who may follow PFAS, literally every day there's something coming out from the federal government or some state government or some new technical change or advancement. So the ground is literally changing beneath our feet. And so having a framework that can maybe help kind of identify what are the key issues and kind of solidify and gel those key issues while everything else changes can really be helpful. We're also looking at potentially some huge NRD liabilities. We have 2 NRD settlements to kind of provide some kind of order of magnitude here. We have the Minnesota settlement from a few years ago for $850 million, which was a huge wake-up call for those of us working in the PFAS world, that there were some huge sums of money on the table. And then there's also been the Delaware settlement for $50 million, which is not trivial either. However, those 2 settlements haven't actually done, as far as we can tell, an actual natural resource damage assessment that's been public and published. And so there's not really a lot of guidance that we can take away from those 2 settlements currently. So the potential benefits of this framework is to really encourage consistency across different stakeholders across the country for how these PFAS assessments could be done, to align the NRD objectives among the different stakeholders and the trustees. And then I think fundamentally to save time and costs, because things are changing so much, literally every day. To the extent that we can kind of establish some of the goalposts and help kind of firm those goalposts in place, then as we do in NRDA, we don't have to, say, go back to the starting block when we realize, oh, gee, we forgot this. And so by setting up some of those key issues up front, hopefully that will streamline the process and make it quicker and cheaper. So this is the framework. It consists of a series of 6 steps. The first one being frame the problem. The second one being understand PFAS usage. 3, establish the discharge pathways. 4, identify receptors. 5, evaluate the service loss. And then lastly, determine restoration alternatives. So this framework doesn't answer any questions. It just raises questions, but hopefully these questions will help establish what the key issues are and help the trustees and the responsible parties work together to address some of those questions, come up with answers, and agree on what those answers should be. So the first step is frame the problem. And this one is undoubtedly the most important one. And that really addresses the issue of which PFAS are we talking about and which regulatory thresholds are we talking about. There are thousands of PFAS chemicals. There is no single definition of what constitutes a PFAS chemical. Here's a lovely quote from the EPA saying, we don't have a definition. There are a few definitions floating around, and based on those different definitions, we have maybe 1,000 PFAS chemicals or even more than 12,000. We literally do not know at this point in time. And so it's important to understand, given the magnitude of how many different PFAS compounds we could be talking about, to make sure, do you want to focus on just a couple, just a few, or do you want to frame a larger issue and focus on a lot of them? As some of you may have heard, or probably all have heard, the EPA has proposed designating PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances a couple weeks ago. Just a note here, when I say PFAS, I'm talking about the larger group. I'm going to spell out the acronyms, say for PFOS, just so there's no confusion. So at least from a kind of federal perspective, we anticipate that at some point soon we will have 2 hazardous substances to work with under CERCLA NRD claims. But individual states have issued guidance or designated other chemicals of interest too. But in addition to just these individual compounds, there's also the larger question of, do you want to address a larger group of PFAS compounds? For example, you may have heard of precursors. So when PFAS are manufactured, they're not necessarily manufactured just, say, PFOA, but manufacturers will make some similar compound, which ultimately breaks down in the environment to PFOA. And so you need to think at the onset of, what do you want to do about those precursors? Do you want to ignore them, or do you want to account for them? And if so, how? If we look at how the 2 existing settled NRDs have addressed this issue, they have done so differently. the Minnesota NRD didn't even use the term PFAS. They used an older term, PFCs. But that NRD specifically covered PFOS, PFOA, and then two shorter chain PFAS compounds. These are 4 carbon chain compounds. The Delaware NRD defined PFAS and used the term that we use today predominantly, but it didn't list specific PFAS chemicals in the settlement. So exactly what they, which ones they were focusing on is not clear. The second part of this problem is critically to establish and make sure you understand which regulatory thresholds you want to work with. In the case of Minnesota, that state could pivot pretty quickly and create its own health-based values for the Cottage Grove NRD. Some states already have some health-based values. These 2 maps here at the bottom, on the left-hand side, we have states that have water standards for PFOS, just as one example. And on the right-hand side, these are states that have soil standards for PFOS. As you can see, there's not complete overlap. Some states just have water standards, some just have soil, some have none, some have both. So establishing what thresholds you want to work with is of critical importance. Moving on to the second step of the framework, that is understanding PFAS usage. And specifically, that's to understand which and how were PFAS used at a site, and specifically which PFAS chemicals were used at a site. This seems pretty straightforward, establish which PFAS chemicals were used historically or are still being used historically, and then how are they used and where were they used? In reality, answering that first question is very tricky because there's not a lot of transparency on which PFAS chemicals are present in different products and different formulations. This is just an example on the bottom right here of a safety data sheet for a chromium plating solution. And at least in this one, they actually tell you what's in it. They name the PFAS chemical, but a lot of these will just say trade secret, or they will generically say floral surfactant, and who knows what that means. So answering this question is tricky, but it's of critical importance. Another reason why it's so important is that a lot of PFAS formulations are not manufactured as a specific chemical, but they're manufactured as either a mixture of chemicals, or if they're aiming for one, they're often impurities. And so understanding what the kind of framework, what the universe of PFAS compounds that may have been used at a site, it's important to understand that. And it's important, going back to item number 1, which of those do you want to actually work with? So on the right here, this is an example of a firefighting foam formulation, and it shows the 25 or so different PFAS compounds that are present in that formulation. Only the compounds in the red box are actually included in the EPA methods. So if you're to use EPA methods as what you establish as your PFAS compounds, that doesn't include the universe of all the PFAS compounds present in this formulation. And alternatively, you could say pick one, PFOS, which happens to be one of the most highest concentration compounds in this mixture, is just a surrogate. The third step is to establish the discharge pathway or pathways, and to understand what is the potential for PFAS to reach the environment. This is just a figure that shows a number of ways that PFAS can be released from facilities and reach the environment. There are kind of direct pathways directly from industrial facilities, and then there are kind of secondary pathways, say via landfills or wastewater treatment plants. As an example, if we look at the New Jersey NRD claim for the Chambers site, that claim lists both direct discharges from the PFAS industry into air via the stacks, but it also lists discharges from the wastewater treatment plant that was treating the industrial waste into surface water, and then also discharges from the landfill via landfill leachate into groundwater. The fourth item on the framework is to identify the receptors. And by this we mean is to determine the potential for PFAS to have reached receptors in the area. And so one has to determine what are those receptors, biological receptors, environmental receptors, ecological receptors, and then establish which PFAS have reached those receptors. Because they can behave differently, the extent to which they can reach or impact these receptors can vary significantly. And then also establish whether those receptors have perhaps already been impacted by other PFAS sources. And I'll explain what I mean by this. If we look at the New Jersey NRD claims, these are very broad and they list practically every natural resource I could possibly think of, different types of waters, sediments and soils, wetlands, forests, air, and a whole slew of biota. So these ones really, they threw everything at the wall. But the extent to which PFAS can impact these different resources and different receptors varies significantly. Say, for example, longer chain PFAS tend to accumulate in soils and tend to bioaccumulate in biota better than, say, the shorter chain compounds, which don't accumulate in soils as well and do not bioaccumulate in animals as well. Another key concept that really should be addressed up front is this idea of whether receptors have already been impacted by PFAS. And with this, we're getting at the concept of background or baseline. And this is not a concept that we normally see with man-made chemicals. We see it with natural chemicals such as arsenic. There would be a natural rate of arsenic concentration in the environment. But because PFAS are used in so many different industrial, commercial, and consumer product applications, and because also we're looking at such low concentrations, we're looking at part per trillion levels, or as Jeff Rose hinted earlier, we might even be looking at part per quadrillion levels. When you're at such low concentrations, you can actually start encountering this kind of man-made baseline or background of PFAS. There have been a few studies that have really demonstrated this quite well. On the right-hand side is a map from a study conducted in Vermont, where researchers collected soil samples throughout the state in public parks, forests, and open public lands, and they detected PFAS in every single soil sample that they collected at varying concentrations. On the right-hand side is a figure that just came out. This was a paper published about a month ago, which made a big splash in the scientific world. And what these researchers had done was collected rainwater samples across the globe and looked for a PFAS occurrence in rainwater. And this graph shows concentrations in different types, in rainwater collected in different areas, different types of areas across the world. In blue, that's near a fluoropolymer plant. Yellow is urban environments. Green is rural environments. And remote is really remote environments like Antarctica. And what they found was that PFAS could be detected in all these different environments, in rainwater in all these different environments at varying concentrations. But the key takeaway was that the dashed line at the very bottom. That is the most recent US EPA health advisory for PFAS of 20 part per quadrillion, or 0.02 part per trillion. And you'll see that practically every rainwater sample, unless you're in Antarctica or Tibet, exceeds that threshold. And so if indeed we are working with thresholds that are that low, we could be encountering this baseline concept. And so we have to be cognizant of that there could be a baseline, figure out what that baseline is, and subtract it out from the rest of the assessment. The next step is to evaluate service loss, meaning establish what services have been lost due to PFAS contamination. And so this is to establish what the service is, be it a fishing resource, a drinking water resource, and determine what the extent of service loss is, which can change depending on which regulatory threshold you're looking at. And so again, this goes back to step one, figure out what those regulatory thresholds are. And then as part of this service loss assessment, separate the service loss due to PFAS due to service loss that may not be due to PFAS, but may be due to other chemicals such as mercury or PCBs. And then also consider baseline that there may be due to PFAS concentrations, just kind of this diffuse background concentration that's due to all of us that may have potentially caused some service loss if we're looking at low enough concentrations. And this service loss can really depend on which particular PFAS you're looking at. So for example, some of the regulatory thresholds that have been established across various states for different compounds vary enormously. So for some of the higher chain compounds, we have much lower concentrations or thresholds. For some of the middle range compounds, we have higher thresholds, meaning that the impact is much less. But the impacts, the amount of service loss can also depend on what the specific resource is. And this is a specific example from Iowa, where the state has established water quality standards, and they have different standards depending on the type of groundwater, whether it's a protected groundwater or non-protected groundwater. And you'll see that for PFOS, there's a 3 order of magnitude or 1,000-fold difference in what would constitute a threshold that would give a service loss. And again, is evaluating the service loss, it's important to understand that certain areas may also be impacted by other chemicals. And so, for example, you could have a fish advisory or fishing advisory, a pre-existing fishing advisory for, say, mercury, and now you have another fishing advisory for PFOS. And so is there an incremental service loss there? That should certainly be evaluated, and a mechanism to distinguish between those should be determined. And the last step of the framework is to determine the restoration alternatives. And by this, we mean what alternatives exist for natural resource restoration. This one is undoubtedly the one that's probably fuzziest at this point in time, given that there are so many changes currently with some of the remediation techniques and treatment technologies that are available. As Jeff Rose indicated earlier, that there are certain facilities that have been asked to just hold on to your PFAS waste while we figure out better technologies to deal with it, because right now it's not good enough. And so that's just something certainly that needs to be kind of discussed up front with the trustees. What remediation is required? Can that remediation compensate for restoration? Can you achieve restoration for all the PFAS of interest? Again, going back to step 1, which PFAS are you focusing on? Because different treatment technologies that we have work very differently for certain PFAS. The higher chain PFAS are at this moment a little easier to treat than some of the lower chain PFAS. And then I should certainly give a plug to the prior framework panel on the restoration panel to see if there are possibilities to bring remediation and restoration together to kind of enhance each other. And a final thing to consider is that, are there technical and practicability challenges? So do we have remediation standards that are below the analytical detection limits, meaning that we don't know how effective our remediation can be? Or do we have cost-effective treatments at this point in time? And so just to look at one example for what Minnesota did after they received that $850 million settlement, they have largely focused on restoring the groundwater resources. As far as I understand, the litigation itself included biological resources, but to date, I haven't seen any plans on restoring or doing restoration for biological resources. Right now, it just appears to be on restoring the groundwater and providing drinking water treatment and clean drinking water to the population that lives within this affected area, to the tune of $700 million. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I will pass off any questions to the rest of the panel.
All right, thank you, Kristen, for a lot of questions, and we have more questions. So I am going to kick things off. We're going to do about 40 minutes or so of pre-scripted questions and some maybe here between our panelists. And then we want to make sure we give plenty of time. I know this is a really emerging area and people probably have a lot of questions in the audience. So we want to make sure we give time for that. So I'm just going to start right here with Keegan because you're closest to me. And just, this is a very new world with NRD and PFAS, but can you provide some commentary on your own experience evaluating PFAS in the NRD context?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Kristen, for very thoughtfully laying out the framework. And I want to emphasize what Kristen said at the outset. Getting on the same page in terms of what we're talking about, which PFAS, which standard, which receptors, these, in my experience, have tended to be the biggest problem because there is a concern that drinking water is the primary receptor of interest, both from a regulatory standpoint and from a trustee standpoint, and that we should focus on that. But when you start to drill down on that issue, it becomes very challenging, both because due to the nature of the compound, the identification of allegedly impacted drinking water supply wells can often be miles and miles from the alleged source. And as I'm sure everyone in this room can anticipate, the number of additional facilities between the alleged source and some of those drinking water supplies are numerous. And so you sort of immediately bump into this issue of, well, wait a minute, why do you think that's my PFAS versus this party who's, you know, a mile away from the wells? I'm 4 miles away from the wells. And that's, in my experience, I mean, these types of sort of really basic fate and transport issues about receptors of greatest interest, they're just hard to get through. And I empathize with the trustees. I mean, they're in a difficult spot. They've got, in many instances, impacted drinking water supplies for a group of contaminants that are being regarded as presenting a significant health risk. And I think there is a desire to try to address those impacted drinking water communities as fast as possible. But in some instances, the science just isn't there. And so you sort of try to make progress, you try to work through the issues, but when it comes down to having a real technical dialogue, sometimes the answer you get is, we just don't know. And we're not sure, maybe it's somebody else's, but we'd like you guys to do the work and just address all these wells. And it's very difficult to get management approval to spend tens of millions of dollars when there isn't, you know, a real concrete technical case that your client's responsible. And again, it's not an overly complex idea, but this sort of lack of science, lack of definition, uncertainty about other sources, it's just difficult to get off the starting line on some of these NRD issues. And I think the framework, as Kristen laid out, is a really positive way to just try to get on the same page with the trustee and the regulator and say, look, let's work the problem and try to find a solution that we can do as an interim step. It may not be the final step, but let's move in a positive direction rather than sort of throwing up all of these issues that we both have on both sides. So, I think that's sort of been my experience, that some of the easiest issues in other environmental cases in this space, they're the most challenging ones.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I have to remember to keep turning this on. Bart, I'll turn to you next since you're next in line.
Yeah, I think Keegan and Kristen have already teed up a bunch of the common themes that we all confront when we try to get our arms around PFAS. From my experience, I've got one case where it's down the Houston Ship Channel where there's a fire, and we're still trying to figure out. We obviously have AFFF that's in the waterway, but there's countless other historical incidents that have occurred. And so what is the baseline? Which PFAS are we really talking about? There's forensic aspects to it because, as Kristen alluded to, A lot of the SDSs that either the first responders had or the facility had proprietary as the indication of what the PFAS constituent was. And further, as you might expect, there's, under, even if they had identified a PFAS constituent, there's the thresholds of, if it was less than 1%, it wouldn't needed to have been identified. And with the levels that we're seeing of concern, a lot of PFAS could be less than 1%. You showed that there were 30 some in the one formulation, 25. So it's a difficult road to navigate to identify whether it's the fate and transport issue, whether it's sort of the forensic analysis of, all right, well, how far did this particular substance go? And then the confounding factors of multiple sources. That's just one example where we're still pretty early on in just the data gathering process. I think the other thing that we are confronting at other sites that I'm dealing with is the pressure to come to an immediate resolution of an impaired drinking water supply. So you understand a municipality wanting to try to remedy impacts to their water supply, but you've got myriad potential sources. It may not be one incident, like a fire, to point to. It may be, and there may not be one single manufacturer to point to. You may have, the local fire department in the municipality itself may have had its own testing pad where they were doing fire training. And so you come back to say, well, maybe you're part of the problem for your water supply impacts. So there's just a fundamental tension, I think, between wanting to effectuate a quick solution, and at least in the PFAS space, almost all the claims that I've seen are really associated primarily with drinking water supply impacts. They may cite to other impacts, to biota or other resource losses, but almost uniformly, the main driver is the drinking water supply impact. And so, there's 20 some, 25 some states that have already asserted NRD claims. Some of those have gotten consolidated in the MDL down in South Carolina. And others are still fighting to try to retain them in their own state courts. But in any event, I think we're just seeing, we're still at a very early stage. And I don't have any great solutions to how to navigate this, but I do think the framework would be an effective way to try to parse out the problem solving that needs to come to pass for there to be maybe scientifically based solutions. Right now, I think it's, the settlements that have occurred, I imagine, 3M in Minnesota just was a huge target. So I can understand why they settled the way they did. DuPont Chemours in Delaware, similar. I mean, they had a manufacturing facility right there. A lot of other places, I think it's going to be a harder road to hoe for the states to get to a quicker settlement without some protracted litigation. And apart from settling for nuisance and litigation cost avoidance, it's hard to imagine that there's going to be a true type of NRDA structured settlement like I've done for mining sites or settlement contamination sites in other contexts without the PFAS impact. I think it's a different animal that I think we're having to confront.
Thank you. So we've heard from the two other attorneys on the panel. Let me kick it over to Bill.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I've had the good fortune to have worked with Keegan, so I've learned a lot from Keegan over this period of time. And Kristen, I thought you did a wonderful job of presenting the framework. I really appreciate that. It was extremely clear and very helpful. There are several points that I think are important here. And that is, in some of these cases, it's not NRD. When we're talking about health effects, I'm sorry, did we read the NRD regulations? Don't the NRD regulations exclude health effects? I seem to remember that that's the case. Now, CERCLA or other state regulations certainly deal with cleanup. And if we're talking about cleanup, that's fine, but that's not natural resource damages. So there is this, commingling, I guess, and particularly if you look at the 3M case, commingling of cleanup and, let's go after everything that we can get. Whereas, in NRD, we're talking about, we've got a release that's associated with a defendant that can prove that there's been an adverse health effect or an adverse effect on a natural resource, and that there's a service loss associated with that natural resource. And then if you have all of those things, then you get the damages. And I think what we've been hearing from the other panelists is that a lot of states are trying to skip a lot of the intermediate steps and going, hey, you've got stuff here. We want money to clean up our problem. And I think that's that's where Keegan's point really is important. It's hard to go to your client and say, hey, we're not even sure that it's really ours. And look at the other sources that really have been operating here for a lot longer than we have. And there's going to be a lot of baseline issues that are going to crop up as one gets into any kind of measuring. Once you can solve Kristen's first problem of what substance are we really talking about here? And is that our substance? So I think you've got to get that hurdle. And that's different, I think, for these chemicals than what we're used to, as Kristen pointed out. It's a lot more complicated. I also think that when we get into some of these kinds of issues, it's real easy to lose sight of the institutions that exist that provide drinking water. Those institutions, in many instances, are private. Okay, and so their NRD doesn't deal with private damages. Now, toxic torts, whatever. But if you want to bring some other kind of lawsuit, that's fine. But an NRD suit, that's supposed to deal with public natural resources. So the groundwater can be, and if they're using groundwater, okay. But that entity that's been affected may be a private entity. So private entities can't bring NRD claims, but they could bring some other suit. And so there's this, I think there's a lot of tension that exists out there between who the water supplier is, the nature of that water supplier, the source of the water that's coming to that water supplier, and all the other elements that go into it. And all the other, and back to Kristen's first point, all the other sources of these chemicals, PFAS, whatever chemicals that are already coming into that facility. So where's yours? What incremental service loss have you caused associated with drinking water at that facility? Now, so if they were already having to treat it for some other substances, so if there is an increment that can be traced to use, then the right economic question and answer would be, okay, it's the incremental cost of treating those extra chemicals that were not already having to be accounted for. But when we start reading some of these lawsuits that Kristen put up there, none of that language is in there, right? It's our drinking water. And people are dying, and you need to fix the problem. And we're going to sue you, and we have sued you. So this is going to be, this may be even more interesting, some of the other cases that have been around from an NRD perspective, and trying to sort through some of these issues. And that, that's even if you can measure some of these substances and be able to say, oh yeah, okay, we can actually observe some incremental ecological service loss associated with these substances at this particular wetland. Good luck. There's going to be a lot of work that's going to have to be done over the next 20 years. I'll be long since retired by then. I promised Barbara I was retiring 10 years ago. I've yet to do that. Keegan won't let me retire. He keeps calling me. But, I think these are some of this is basic NRD. And I think that's kind of my fundamental point is that when we start talking about some of these things, we need to bring it back to, and that's what the framework helps to do, is let's bring it back to basic NRD. I still like to have the words like causation in there, that it's being caused by. There are measured adverse effects, and there are real service losses. Great. Then we can deal with damages if we can have all of those things.
Well, thank you. So I think one of the big themes we just heard is that we're really at the beginning stages of NRD when it comes to PFAS. So thinking about the framework, what would be some of the benefits, Bart, I'll start with you, of using a framework like the one that Kristen presented at any case or site? If you have a specific one, you feel free to mention it, but any kind of case or site.
I think Bill sort of outlined some of that already. I mean, I think we're probably the sites that I'm working on right now. We're still really at a data gathering stage, and sort of so I think we're still at step one of the framework in many respects, because we're still trying to figure out what are really the drivers in terms of which constituents of PFAS are the most concern. And then assessing, all right, so how many of these do we really have to deal with? Does it all devolve down to PFOA and PFOS, because those are the longest chain and maybe potentially the most persistent or bioaccumulative? And maybe they are the final degradation products of some of the other substances that may have also been discharged, but we're still trying to sort that out. In terms of what types of sources or usage, at least the site I'm thinking of in Houston, that's not really a concern. At least the target on my client is because of the fire and the AFFF. And so we know pretty readily that a major source was AFFF. But I think that the framework, if we were able to implement this and get the trustees at issue, and unfortunately, it's not just the trustees, we're dealing with a variety of other parties, but if we were able to get a consensus that the framework would be the process for ultimately valuing whatever the NRD losses are, it'd be hugely beneficial to my client. But I think it's a major step to get to that process. I'm not sure we would get ready buy-in from the trustees for one, or from the other regulatory entities that are concerned about the NRD. It's not so much that they are trustees, but they would have influence over any settlement. So that's my concern, is how do we get to some sort of effective buy-in on this being the regimen to be applied. I know one of the other questions we had talked about, I mean, I do think getting other support from organizations like ECOS and ITRC would be beneficial to the framework. I know that's a question to the prior panel, but I think the more endorsements you can get from those sorts of standards setting organizations, or those that opine on effective approaches to things like PFAS, like ITRC has its whole slew of fact sheets on PFAS and treatment technologies for PFAS and the variety and state standards and all that. And it's a hugely beneficial resource. And I think if they were to align themselves with the ad hoc groups, or if we were able to get their endorsement in some fashion, I think that would be beneficial.
Keegan, are there any specific characteristics that you can think of? I know you were involved in helping to frame frame the framework. Are there any characteristics that you have in mind that you think would be helpful in implementing the framework at any location?
Yeah, early intervention. We've all seen examples, these issues with PFAS, usually in drinking water communities, as Bart and Bill and others have said, they get off the scientific road and wander into the political road real fast. And when you have an impacted drinking water community, that's a political problem that needs to be solved. That needs to be solved relatively soon. I think one of the things that the framework provides is an opportunity to go to the relevant regulator or trustee at the very first instance of a potential issue and say, look, before we all start issuing press releases that are going to raise a bunch of concerns in the community and exert an amount of pressure that's going to require us to take action we can't do without actually having a data collection phase, let's sit down and agree on a process. And then we'll work the process, right? And much like with Superfund allocation, we have a process. Your client is sometimes less happy than others, but at least they feel like they got their say, right? Because they had a process, they knew when they could comment, they knew when they could meet with the allocator. You feel like you got an opportunity to make your case. We need something like that in PFAS. There is no real meaningful opportunity for that kind of stuff. You try to have the dialogue, but you don't have the data. Why? Because you can't measure it. You try to talk about other sources, but they don't know the answer. Why? Because they didn't ask those parties to send in information about their discharges. So you have these information vacuums that create practical impediments to getting anything done. And so I think if you can have an upfront conversation early on, talk about the framework and try to get alignment with the regulator on, let's do this. Let's sign a cooperation agreement, just like we would if we were doing a cooperative NRD. Let's go through these steps. When the issue then becomes a little more refined, we all have a better understanding, we can work on what we would tell, people who may be affected, but let's gather the facts before we just start saying things, because then we're going to have a bunch of residents who are concerned and we don't have any answers. That would be a wonderful place. But it's going to take some effort because these issues get political very, very fast. And I think there is a concern given what's going on in the MDL. Bart mentioned like more than half the states have filed NRD claims. You don't want to be the only one without a chair when the music stops. And I think some of these attorney generals are understandably concerned about, do I have to just bring a lawsuit now, kind of work it out through litigation because I can't afford to take the risk that, something happens and I didn't take a strong stand against, a PFAS polluter in my jurisdiction. So these are very complicated issues. We have, technical issues, legal issues, political issues, but I don't think we're going to solve any of them if we're not talking. And so I do think early intervention is really the key here.
And Bill, you identified a number of issues related to PFAS, but are there benefits to using the framework that you see from your work in actually conducting NRDAs?
Yeah, I do. I think that the real benefit of the framework is that it provides a structure for the conversations that Keegan's talking about. And it's a very straightforward, common sense structure. I think it does a nice job of laying out what it is that we need to try to deal with. So that it also then helps you to begin to ask the right questions. If you can begin a conversation like Keegan discussed or mentioned, you can then say, okay, well, how are we going to approach identifying the sources? What data do we need in order to be able to do that? What resources are our concern here? What data do we need to be able to screen those in or screen those out, as to, are there ways of being able to circumscribe the issues in a particular case to where you're really focused on that resource that's really, the resource or resources that are the most important, that are most likely to be affected by your client and the releases from your client's facilities versus the more galactic kinds of questions. And if you can get to that, then I think you have a chance of actually, doing some good scientific work like Kristen does, doing some good ecological work to understand the surface water quality, groundwater quality, and then beginning to identify, well, how would we quantify any service losses that have impacted here? But Keegan's right. You gotta have data. You can't do it without data. I'm sorry. And we're being asked to, we're being asked in a number of instances. Well, let's not worry about it. What do you think? Well, I don't know what to think because I don't have any data. So you really do. You need to be able to identify, I think, also what methods are you going to use, and what are you going to include? Okay, to me, the real question here is, what are you going to do about the health effects question? If you're a client, what are you going to do about the health effects question? If you're really dealing with NRD, then you say, okay, that's not NRD. But if your client says, okay, that's not NRD, but we may have a cleanup question. And so that would be relevant to what we have to do to clean up the site. Then, okay, that you at least begin to put things in the right box. But you don't call health effects NRD. I'm sorry. They're just not. And so to me, I've always been a big believer in you got to define the things right to begin with. And the framework does help us to be able to do that.
So it sounds like, I'm going a little off script here. Sounds like everybody's describing still the step one in the framework. Have any of the panelists experienced in the world of PFAS getting what might be beyond step one in a situation where this framework might have actually been helpful to use earlier? This is an open question.
Yeah, I think step 3 about establishing the discharge pathways, it would be great to tee that up sooner rather than later. I've definitely worked on sites where we thought the focus was groundwater. Everybody was sort of working on gathering groundwater data, doing fate and transport analysis, all that typical stuff, looking for other sources. Then we found out, no, there's also a air pathway that we think is significant. Well, okay, that's a whole different line of, technical work that we hadn't been developing at the same speed. And so it then kind of put us in this, situation where some lines of analysis were further progressed than others, which then made having conversations about how to find a successful resolution extremely challenging. So I do think, again, trying to get the conversation going about which are the pathways that you're both interested in now and that you think you are going to need to score in order to get to yes, because I would like to know as soon as possible what those are. And let's reach alignment on what those pathways are. And then we'll work through them. But let's make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think where I'm dealing with PFAS and NRD, we haven't really matured to the later phases. I mean, clearly dealing with PFAS and step 6 and trying to define effective remediation approaches. I'm dealing with that a lot, and short of saying, incinerate it, if you can find a incinerator that still is operating and allowed to take PFAS that hasn't been shut down or prohibited from taking PFAS. There's a variety of treatment trains that are being looked at, but and some may be incredibly effective. I mean, I've heard of all sorts of novel approaches to ways to systematically break down the carbon fluorine chain. I think the New York Times just had an article, I think in the last week, about one innovative approach. But that said, at scale, I think we're still looking at a lot of questions. I think Keegan alluded to the fact that, leaving stuff stored for temporarily until we have a better solution is, unfortunately, I think a recommendation I've already made a couple of times to clients. If there's no imminent need to get it off site. So, but that's not directly responsive to your question, but unfortunately, that's where I'm at with my experience with on the NRD front.
Bill, what about you? Have you had any occasion to progress beyond simply what is identified as step one, where maybe the framework would have been helpful from the get-go?
Well, yeah, well, unfortunately, what we have in several instances is people saying, you owe us money, and we're not going to tell you, we told you how much we want, and we're not going to tell you how we got that amount. So it's like, okay, so what step is that? Because we have no idea where your number came from, and we just don't see it for this particular site. So there's just, things have not progressed linearly in the world of PFAS litigation. And I think it goes back to what Keegan said earlier. There's that the political forces in some of these things are just, strong, very strong. And there's a lot of legitimate concerns. But at the same time, there's not much patience either. So it's hard right now. It's really hard right now to deal with some of these instances where you just may not have enough information to be able to respond to some of the claims that have been made. So we'll stay tuned. Maybe a year from now, will we be singing any different tune next year at Barbara's Symposium about the state of the world here? I don't know. I really don't. Maybe we're right that we'll see some newer treatment methods that may make this a little more encouraging in terms of where things are. Maybe we'll have a few reasonable trustees. I'm still looking for one of those, by the way. But people continue to talk about reasonable trustees, and maybe that'll help. And maybe we'll have some litigation. Maybe we'll have some litigation that actually moves ahead, and people start collecting the information as part of that litigation and we'll learn from that process. I think your firm does do a little bit of that litigation stuff, if I'm not mistaken. Just a little bit from what I've heard.
Just a little.
Just a little bit.
So I wanted just to pose one more question before we turn to the audience. There's been a lot of discussion about the problems so far with getting the NRD off the ground and kind of starting at step one. What are the opportunities that you all see representing your particular clients for collaboration among the different constituencies? Because PFAS is of concern to not just trustees, but also as have been identified other constituencies. What opportunities do you see?
Yeah, I mean, we're largely writing on a clean slate here, so we ought to try to be creative to solve a problem. I think one of the big opportunities here, especially given the ubiquitous nature of PFAS, the reality that we undoubtedly will have many other sources in any geographic area, is to take another hard look at the NRD crediting system. If I have to spend $10 million, but I'm going to get $90 million in NRD credit that I can use at other sites all across the country or in that jurisdiction or however it's going to work, or I can sell them on a market and get value, I might be willing to do that, right? I mean, there has to be some upside for folks to essentially raise their hand in a litigation environment where if you do that, your prize is more litigation, right? So how are you going to incentivize people who don't think they're responsible to volunteer, to take responsibility for PFAS impacts that are in their community or elsewhere? You got to give them something, right? And so I think the crediting system is an opportunity, right? Making sure we work on, we put money to work, we restore natural resources. The party who's performing the work gets a multiplier credit that they can use or sell or however we want to structure it. But then at least they've gotten something. And I think, we heard this morning when, Juliet was talking, we heard it from Heidi and others and Roger. I mean, the focus on ESG. I think I have a lot of clients who, from an ESG perspective, might actually think this is a pretty attractive proposition to say, you know what, I'm going to fund some work that I don't really think I'm responsible for. I'm going to package it up as an ESG initiative. It's going to be good for my investors. People will be happy about that. Then I'm going to take those credits and I'm going to monetize them and sell them. And I'm either going to break even or maybe make some money on this. And in the interim, we clean up a problem. I think there's opportunity for stuff like that. I mean, we just have to think outside the typical box and try to work it through. But for me, the NRD crediting system provides a big upside here that if we can align it with ESG considerations, I think there might be a lot in the private, a lot of individuals in the private sector who would be interested in having a discussion along these lines.
Bart or Bill, do either of you have any final insights before we open it up to questions?
I mean, Keegan's idea is creative and may be viable. I mean, I think we'd have to see. I mean, we all, my experience with the wetland banking credit system in the past has been spotty, sometimes beneficial, sometimes has drawn a lot of scrutiny. And so I do think that if it's managed properly, I suppose it could be an effective alternative. I think a lot of benefit could come from trying to reach across to some of the stakeholders. I mean, even my firm, we represent both PRPs as well as water utilities. And I think if the water utilities are in the crosshairs on PFAS because they don't really want to be telling their customers that they're receiving a tainted product. But then at the same time, they're suing the AFFF manufacturers for contaminating a water supply. So there's a lot of tension there about, and so I do think that at least the water utility community is one potential stakeholder that would appreciate there being some middle of the road or moderated approach to trying to manage the resource impacts. And there may be other similarly situated. I think the POTWs are sort of in the same boat. They have nothing to do with generating PFAS, but they're taking it out, and now they're being claimed for targeted with liability, like in Georgia or Tennessee or Alabama, for applying biosolids to agriculture fields, and that then either results in runoff affecting surface water, or creates groundwater impacts where the biosolids are placed. So there's a variety of parties out there, I think, that are caught in the web of PFAS liability, that if we could get more of a meeting of the mind, whether it's congressional hearings, to at least get something going to say, yes, PFAS is a problem, but if we keep saying it's a problem, it's a problem, it's a problem, and so far all we're doing is being asked to throw money at it without a more logical, data-driven process to target and address it and try to come to effective solutions. I think it's we're just kicking the can down the road.
Thank you, everyone. I want to make sure we open the floor to questions. I think there's a microphone coming your way.
Hi, Paul Bohm. Hello. Hi, Bill. You can't see me. I think it's easy to get exasperated by this topic. I noticed a little bit of that in Bill's tone, but I think there's some hope in the framework. I want to specifically talk about step 2, which is what chemicals are concerned and what resources. In my limited experience here, PFAS is all about water and maybe soils. It's about groundwater. It's about surface water and maybe soils as a contributor to groundwater. There's no evidence right now, and there's a lot of publications, no evidence that any other natural resource is threatened and certainly not injured. So I'm wondering, is there a screening step specifically in the framework, or can you put that in there to kind of get resources not not on the table, but off the table quickly, using available data, using available science? Let's use the science that's out there. And there's a tremendous amount of science being generated, which to me shows the resources at risk here are very limited. So Bill's screening comment, I think, is right apropos.
So Paul, that's a really, really good point. We do not have a screening step in there to say, perhaps use literature data to kind of screen out which resources might not be affected. You know, going back to that example with New Jersey, where they literally listed every natural resource I could possibly think of. So I think that's a great idea that we should go back and consider to add to our framework, you know, some kind of screening step so that maybe we could take kind of thin that list to what's critically important.
Yeah, it's a good idea, Paul. I mean, I think the one immediate sort of complication I could see with that is there may be concerns that there's not a robust enough literature set where we can sort of make those decisions. So I can already hear we'll screen it out for now, but if in the next 3 years, while we're doing some of this data collection, we have reason to believe that it, you know, may be an issue, we reserve the right to put it back on, which, you know, maybe that's a workable compromise. So you don't spend some of that money up front investigating a resource, but I think the New Jersey complaint is emblematic of the typical approach, which is let's claim for everything and we'll figure it out later. So I think if we could come up with a good screening mechanism, that would certainly improve the efficiency of the framework. It's a good idea.
At least you don't have to spend the money up front, maybe later.
Right. Yeah. No, look, I mean, if you can, and at least you can focus the conversation. And if you're, you know, you can get somebody to focus in on it. With any luck, we can keep that same point person for the trustee in the same chair to see it all the way through. But yeah, that would be helpful.
You foresaw my own point on the ever evolving, changing science in this world, in particular on PFAS. Anybody online with questions? I thought there would be more, but maybe it's so late in the day, everybody's tired.
Excellent. Oh, yeah. Oh, Chad has a question.
Well, it's not a question as much as a comment. And if it is true that you can get some of these resources off and really focus on water, you know, when you're starting to look at the service change issues, so many of the data and so much of the information is more about sort of regional water management and institutions than it is molecules. So I think I don't know the extent to which the framework points this out, but that service change part, most of the groundwater cases that I've been involved with for NRD were really resolved on things like, well, what does the interstate compact say about where the water can go? Or what are the limitations placed on drawdown of an aquifer to prevent subsidence or, you know, have base flow? So there are all these idiosyncratic water management institutions that are very local that really drive how water behaves at baseline and with contamination and remediation. And it's that difference. And, you know, that understanding those is very different than understanding molecules. And it's a super important part of understanding what it is that you're facing in reality, as opposed to potentials that could be drawn off of concentrations that are scary.
I think I recognize that voice, even though I couldn't see him.
And then I wanted to follow up on your retirement here, Bill.
You trying to push me out the door, Ted?
I don't know about, because I haven't read all of the background within the framework other than the, Kristen, your excellent summary. But I think that is something that people miss. There's a lot of focus on molecules and less on institutional aspects of water management and regional supplies and demands, which is really where you're getting to, what are the real problems and what are the potential restoration actions that can be taken where you could, apply costs in kind of a reasonable way.
I think that's a really good point. And it's certainly any of these groundwater cases, you have to really understand the supply and demand picture. And it is a more often, as you point out, a regional one. And then I think you layer on top of that now the kind of changing structure of companies like New Jersey American Water that are continually acquiring municipal water suppliers. And so that you now have these for-profit entities that are providing water. So that institution now is changing over time as well. So there are fewer and fewer of the municipal suppliers out there, say compared to 10 years ago. So you also look at regional supply and demand, and then you factor into, well, who really is the water supplier here? And are they a public entity or a private entity? Because that obviously has a difference in terms of what the circumstances will be and what Keegan has to do in terms of all of his legal expertise. So that's a good question, good comment.
Sarah has one chat.
Yes, so I do want to include our remote participants that have held in all day.
Read, and then we'll summarize and we'll
Yeah.
move to the summary of the day.
So we do have a comment from Jeffrey, and I'm going to butcher your last name. I apologize, because Siklasky from the Maine Attorney's General Office. And he wants to, point out that he's hearing about lack of injuries from PFAS to natural resources, except for water resources. But what about fish, turkeys, deer, and other wildlife that's yet to be studied for PFAS to contamination? He's, indicated, just wants it to be known that it's already been found in turkey, deer, and fish, and that it will likely be found in other wildlife species. So just a point that I wanted to raise.
Okay, so excellent panel, excellent presentation. Did a super job making something complex very straightforward. So I think I hear that we have a little bit of work to do on this framework. We have a little bit of work to do on the prior one. I think now we're going to move to a quick summary of the day, and I can do that with Randy if you want to be part of that. I think that it is, and the panel can stay put if you want or go back to your seats, whatever you wish. Can we put this here? Yeah. We've heard so much today that I think that it's virtually impossible to summarize it. I was going to say a few words, and then if Randy wants to add to that, I would welcome him to do that. I did have someone taking notes, but we will be digesting both days in terms of what we heard and where we go and what some of the options are. So I wrote on a sheet of paper, I wrote a whole bunch of words today that I heard. So at the top of my paper, I wrote big opportunity, big mandate, big challenge. Because I think that that is, in a sense, some of what I hear. We heard this morning from Roger, Sally, others, about a lot of things that are changing in the way we do things, and a lot of really positive opportunities and a lot of progress. We heard a lot about climate. We heard that it's a transformative time. We heard that it's a pivotal time. We heard a lot about collaboration, which is, of course, the theme of this symposium. We heard a little later this afternoon about the need to have early intervention, early communication. We heard about sustainability. We heard about efficiency. We heard about voluntary actions. We heard about private governance. We obviously heard about corporate social responsibility, as Roger termed it, to be a new driver for change. We heard about COVID as a catalyst, and I think we've all seen that. We heard a lot about equity. I think equity has become an issue that has transcended all of our conversation today. We heard about a different trajectory. We heard about biodiversity in nature. We heard about possible coalitions. We heard about resilience, incentives, getting people on the same page. We heard about uncertainty. We heard about structuring the conversation or having a structure for conversations. We heard about crossroads, investments, disclosure, interdependencies, science, the role of science, the role of technology. So I wrote down all these things because I think they come back up to what I wrote on the top of the page, which is big opportunity, big mandate, big challenge. So I'm going to let Randy say what he thought, but obviously we have a whole day tomorrow, and I'll give you a quick preview after Randy says a few words here of tomorrow and telling you where we're going. But obviously we're going to be spending time going through what we've heard here, my staff and myself, others in the working groups. We have 3 different working groups, and digesting this and trying to package and parse out back to you some of what we've heard and where we go from here on some of these things. So with that, it is virtually impossible for me to do a summary per se, but I just thought I would tell you about my notes. So Randy, if you want to add to that, and then I'll talk about tomorrow.